The last promise Adrian ever made her was whispered against the shell of her ear, his breath cool with the scent of aged wine and ancient triumph. It was their coronation night, 3 centuries after he had turned her from a dying merchant's daughter into his immortal bride. The crown, a cold weight of gold and rubies that would adorn her head for eternity, still felt foreign despite the decades she had spent preparing for this moment. He had led her to the balcony overlooking the silent, moon-drenched gardens of the palace that would be their dominion for the next 1,000 years, the cheers of the vampire court a distant surge of power and ambition behind them. "Forever," he had murmured, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with the careful reverence of one who had crafted her immortality with his own blood. "You and I, my queen, my equal, for all the centuries to come, until the stars themselves grow cold." Lissa had closed her eyes and believed him with the desperate faith of one who had been given a second chance at existence. She remembered the girl she had been, dying of fever in a cramped room above her father's shop, remembered the moment Adrian had appeared like salvation itself, offering her not just life, but forever. She had taken his blood willingly, had endured the 3 nights of transformation, had emerged as something more than human, something powerful and eternal. And she had loved him with the intensity that only the newly immortal could manage, that desperate clinging to the one who had given you eternity. It took 30 years for that foundation to crumble into dust, though in the span of immortal existence, 30 years was merely a breath, a blink, a moment of terrible compression. Forever became a series of endless nights in their shared chambers, a bed that grew colder and wider with each passing decade, despite the fact that neither of them required sleep, the pretense of rest becoming just another ritual they performed in an increasingly hollow mockery of intimacy. Equal became the silent, decorative thing she was meant to be at his side during the interminable court sessions, her opinions dismissed with a patronizing smile that showed just the hint of fang, a reminder that he was older, stronger, that he had made her and could unmake her if he chose. Queen became the title she wore while his paramours, brazen and beautiful vampiresses who had walked the earth for centuries before Lissa had even been born, paraded through the very halls she was supposed to command, their laughter echoing like a personal mockery. The first time, a vampiress with eyes the color of summer twilight and the predatory grace of 500 years, Lissa had confronted him in his private study. He had laughed, a booming, careless sound that had shattered something delicate within her. "She's a diversion, my love, nothing more than a brief entertainment in the endless expanse of our existence. You are my queen, my eternal companion." He had kissed her then, a conqueror's kiss, meant to silence and possess and remind her of the bond of blood between them, not to connect or cherish. She stopped confronting him after the 3rd paramour, after the 5th, after she lost count somewhere around the 20th year. She learned the language of his dismissals, the cadence of his lies. She begged once, on the eve of what would have been her 350th human birthday, for a single night, just one evening where they could walk through the moonlit forests as they had done in the early years of her transformation. He had agreed, with what seemed like genuine warmth. She waited all evening in her chambers, had dressed in the dark riding clothes she kept for hunts, had even abstained from feeding so they might hunt together. He never came. A vampire servant, eyes carefully downcast, later informed her that the king had been entertaining a delegation from the Eastern Covens, specifically the visiting Blood Prince's consort. Lissa had thanked the servant with perfect crystalline composure. That night she did not weep, for vampires could not produce tears. But she felt something inside her die nonetheless, that part of her that could still be wounded by him, finally, blessedly, turning to ash. So she stopped asking and started watching. It was a subtle shift, one no one noticed. Her quietness was mistaken for acquiescence, her placid expression for contentment. But behind her eyes, ancient and knowing despite her relative youth, a ledger was being filled with meticulous care. She sat through endless council meetings in the grand chamber where Adrian held court, a silent effigy at the head of the obsidian table. And she listened with the supernatural hearing that let her catch every whispered aside, every nervous swallow, every lie. She memorized the nervous tick of Lord Corvinus, the Minister of Trade, the way his fingers would drum against the table when he spoke of the human population numbers he was secretly deflating to hide the blood farms he was running for personal profit. She noted the way Ambassador Constantine from the northern reaches would never quite meet the king's eye, and through careful observation, she discovered he was feeding information to the rival coven beyond the mountains. She learned that Lord Valerius owed his considerable fortune to a smuggling operation that moved illegal blood sources and forbidden grimoires across protected borders, an operation that Adrian himself had sanctioned in exchange for a percentage and Valerius's unwavering public support. She discovered that General Marius maintained his command not through merit, but because Adrian held evidence of the general's role in a failed coup 3 centuries prior. Every whispered conversation, every clandestine letter, every favor promised and debt incurred, she gathered them all with the patient precision of an immortal who had finally found purpose. She saw the intricate web of dependencies, threats, and blackmail that Adrian called a kingdom. He thought it was held together by his strength and political acumen. Lissa saw the truth. It was a structure of brittle threads, and she was learning the location of every single one. She began creating copies of sensitive documents, using her position as queen to access Adrian's private study when he was distracted, carefully memorizing contents before replacing them exactly as they had been. She cultivated relationships with the palace servants, the invisible army who saw everything but were never seen, offering them small kindnesses and genuine respect, building a network of eyes and ears. She made careful withdrawals from her personal accounts, converting the funds into portable assets and storing them with a discreet banker in the human city that bordered their territory, a vampire who owed no loyalty to Adrian's court. She watched Dorian, her husband's chief advisor, the longest. He was a vampire of considerable age, nearly 800 years old, though he carried his centuries with quiet grace. He had been a scholar before his transformation and remained one after, his immortality devoted to the study of vampire history. He was made of quiet observations and careful silences, and unlike the others, he seemed to truly see the patterns in Adrian's court, the instability beneath the surface. She would catch his gaze across the throne room during particularly egregious displays of Adrian's cruelty, and in his dark eyes she saw not pity, but a shared, painful understanding. He never spoke a word against the king, but his silence was different. It was not the silence of complicity, but of sorrow. He was the only one who seemed to see her, not as the queen or Adrian's acquisition, but as a person with her own thoughts and pain. Over several years, they developed a careful, unspoken communication. A certain tilt of the head during council meetings that meant, "This is a lie." A particular pause that signaled, "There is more to this than appears." It was Dorian who, late one night in the palace library, finally broke the silence between them. He had not looked at her directly, his eyes on an ancient manuscript, but his voice had been soft and clear. "There is a life beyond these walls, Your Majesty, for those brave enough to seek it." The night she left, the air was thick with the promise of a storm. She wore a simple traveling cloak the color of midnight, her ceremonial gowns left folded like shed skins of a life she was abandoning. She took nothing of obvious value, only a leather satchel containing several changes of plain clothing, the portable assets she had been accumulating, and a sheaf of carefully organized documents that represented the complete dismantling of Adrian's power structure. In her private study, she left a single letter on Adrian's desk. It contained only 2 words in her precise script: "I am done." But throughout the territory, her paid messengers were delivering other letters, dozens of them, each one precisely calculated to sever a specific thread in Adrian's web. To Lord Valerius went complete documentation of his smuggling routes, including detailed maps and financial records, with copies sent simultaneously to the Minister of Trade and to the Vampire Council that governed interterritorial crime. To Ambassador Constantine went proof of his double dealing, sent to both Adrian's court and to the Northern Coven leadership, ensuring neither side would ever trust him again. To General Marius went a full pardon for the ancient coup attempt, documentation that absolved him and his progeny, along with proof that Adrian had been using this information for blackmail for 3 centuries. She sent evidence of Lord Corvinus's illegal blood farms to the human resistance movements. To every major noble, she sent precisely calibrated information designed to shatter trust and create chaos. She had even written to Adrian's rivals, sending detailed intelligence about his actual military strength and defensive vulnerabilities. She didn't tear down the kingdom with violence. She simply showed everyone the truth simultaneously and let it collapse under its own weight. She met Dorian by the old Sally Port, a forgotten exit hidden behind a tapestry. He was dressed as a common traveler, 2 horses waiting in the gloom. He didn't ask if she was sure. He simply took her satchel, his hand brushing hers in a touch that was brief, but which carried more genuine care than any of Adrian's possessive embraces. "He will hunt you," Dorian said, his voice low and certain. "When he discovers what you've done, his rage will be legendary." Lissa looked at him steadily, and for the first time in 30 years, she felt no fear, only a vast, terrifying, and exhilarating sense of freedom. "Let him," she replied. "I have spent 3 decades being afraid. I am done with fear." They rode into the gathering storm, their supernatural speed eating up the miles, and behind them, a kingdom began its catastrophic collapse. Adrian found her letter just after sunset. He read the 2 words and laughed. Done? She couldn't be done. She was his creation, bound to him by blood and law. This was a tantrum, feminine drama meant to get his attention. He called for servants to search her chambers, then the palace, then the territory. By midday, when servants reported her complete absence and that she had left with someone matching Dorian's description, Adrian felt the first flicker of concern. By sunset of that second night, when the reports began arriving, concern transformed into something visceral. Lord Valerius sent an emergency message declaring he was being investigated for smuggling, effectively removing him from Adrian's alliance. Ambassador Constantine had been found destroyed by the Northern Coven for his treachery. General Marius appeared at court with cold fury, presenting the pardon documents and demanding an explanation for 3 centuries of blackmail. Reports flooded in of blood farm raids, of nobles fleeing, of ancient vampires who had supported Adrian suddenly declaring opposition. Lord Corvinus was dead, killed by resistance fighters. By the end of that second night, Adrian's council was in chaos, his alliances shredding, his territory destabilizing so rapidly that border regions were being claimed by rival covens. By the 3rd night, Adrian understood with horrible clarity that this was a coordinated, devastating attack, and the architect was the quiet queen he had ignored for 3 decades. She hadn't destroyed his kingdom with violence. She had simply, methodically, removed every support structure and walked away to let it collapse. His fury was a physical thing, a white-hot inferno that made his fangs extend and his eyes blaze. It wasn't the fury of one who had lost his love. It was the incandescent rage of a king, unmade by his most underestimated possession. And one other piece struck him like a blow. Dorian was gone, had helped her escape. The quiet advisor who had stood by his side for 800 years had chosen her over him. He would find them, he swore. He would hunt them to the ends of the earth, would drag her back, and show her what it meant to defy a king. He would make her watch as he destroyed the advisor who had stolen her away. But first, he had to stabilize what remained. It took him 5 years of brutal political maneuvering, violent suppression of rivals, costly concessions. His once vast domain had shrunk to barely half its former size. His court was now a shadow, populated by younger vampires of questionable loyalty. His reputation was permanently damaged, the story of how a fledgling queen had outmaneuvered an ancient king becoming a cautionary tale. And through it all, his obsession with finding Lissa and Dorian grew into something monomaniacal. He poured resources into the search that his struggling kingdom could ill afford. He told himself it was about justice, about punishing treason, but he knew it was something else. She had been the mirror in which he had seen his own greatness. Without her, he was forced to see himself clearly, and what he saw was an empty, angry creature who had mistaken control for love. The human world was a revelation to Lissa. Walking through the streets of the coastal town of Silverwood under the cover of night, she felt like she was discovering an entirely new dimension of existence. The town was a thriving port, busy at all hours, meaning vampires moving through the streets after dark drew no attention. The air smelled of salt and fish and wet wood. People worked through the night, their faces open and unguarded. No one bowed. No one watched her with calculation. She was blessedly, terrifyingly anonymous. For the first several weeks, she barely spoke, overwhelmed by the scale of her new freedom. Dorian was a constant, grounding presence. Through his connections, he secured them a small house on the outskirts of town, overlooking the back, restless gray sea. It had 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above, though neither required sleep, the space serving as a private retreat for the day hours. It had a hearth they kept burning for comfort, and furniture that was simple but comfortable. It was roughly the size of a single room in Adrian's palace, but to Lissa, it was the most beautiful place she had ever inhabited, because it was hers, truly hers. Dorian gave her space as if it were a physical gift. He would rise in the evening, prepare tea from habit, and leave it for her before going out into the town. He quickly found ways to be useful, his supernatural strength making him valuable for night labor at the docks. His scholarly nature also made him sought after by merchant families who paid him to tutor their children. He would return near dawn, his clothes smelling of sea air and honest work, and they would share the remaining hours in comfortable silence. The silence wasn't empty like the palace. This was comfortable quiet, filled with the crackle of fire and the crash of waves, a silence that healed. Slowly, Lissa began to construct an identity outside of being someone's possession. She discovered an affinity for herbalism, knowledge from her human life that had been dormant. She began cultivating a small garden in the rocky soil near their house, her vampire nature giving her almost supernatural sensitivity to the plants. The local apothecary, an elderly human woman named Marjorie, began purchasing her cultivated herbs and remedies for common human ailments. For the first time in her immortal existence, Lissa had an income entirely her own, earned through her own skill. She had a purpose that had nothing to do with looking beautiful or playing political games. She was genuinely helping people, and the satisfaction was profound. She started to talk to Dorian, first in small fragments, then in longer, more searching conversations as they sat by the fire. She learned he came from minor nobility in a long-dead kingdom. The second son turned into a vampire during a territorial war 8 centuries ago. She learned he had devoted his existence to study, to understanding patterns in vampire society. She learned his quietness was both nature and necessity, a temperament that valued observation, but also a survival mechanism. He told her, one night while a fierce storm raged outside, why he had helped her escape. "I watched him destroy you," Dorian said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Night after night, year after year. Every casual cruelty, every public humiliation. It was like watching someone tear the wings off a butterfly and not even notice what they were destroying. You became quieter, more hollow, and he never even saw it." His voice held centuries of accumulated sorrow. "I couldn't speak against him directly. That would have been treason. But when I realized you were planning something, I knew I had to help. I could open the gate, show you the path out." Lissa felt something, ancient and painful, loosen in her chest. For so long, her suffering had been a private, secret thing. To know that someone else had seen, had understood, had cared enough to risk everything, it was a revelation. "You saw me," she whispered. "In all that court full of ancient vampires, you were the only one who actually saw me as a person who was suffering." He finally turned to look at her. "I saw you," he confirmed quietly. "And what I saw was someone far stronger than anyone realized. You didn't just survive Adrian's cruelty. You studied it, learned from it, turned it into a weapon and wielded it with precision. You dismantled an entire kingdom with nothing but information and timing. That takes a kind of strength most vampires never develop, even across millennia." In that moment, Lissa felt the first true thaw of the ice that had encased her heart for 30 years. The fear of Adrian was still there, but for the first time, she felt something else growing. A fragile, tentative trust in another person. A belief that perhaps not all relationships were built on power and control. They sat closer together, their shoulders nearly touching, sharing warmth and space and the comfortable silence of two people who had begun to trust each other. Months bled into years with the strange fluidity that time took on for vampires. The raw terror of Adrian's pursuit gradually faded to a low hum of caution. Dorian had been brilliantly strategic in their escape, deliberately choosing Silverwood because it was so mundane, so lacking in strategic importance, that no one would think to look for a queen there. Lissa's hands grew strong from gardening and crafting remedies, her skills developing until Marjorie began teaching her more advanced techniques. She expanded her garden, then began teaching local girls about plant cultivation, finding deep satisfaction in passing on knowledge. She had an income, a reputation as the skilled herbalist who kept odd hours, a purpose entirely her own. Her relationship with Dorian evolved with slow, organic pace, a connection built on 1,000 small moments. It was in the way he would leave rare plant specimens on her workbench. It was in the way she would save portions of human food she sometimes prepared, because she had learned he found the ritual comforting. It was in the comfortable silences, the shared appreciation for a beautiful moonrise, the instinctive way they moved around each other. There was deep, unspoken tenderness between them, a careful dance around the wounds they both carried. But the past never truly released its grip on immortals. 7 years after their escape, a traveling vampire merchant came through Silverwood, speaking in the Tavern of Kingdoms in turmoil, of the vampire territories that had been destabilized by political collapse, of a king who had lost half his domain and most of his sanity. He called Adrian the Ghost King, a ruler haunted by his failures, obsessed with finding his lost queen. The merchant spoke of Adrian's continued hunt, the resources he still poured into tracking them, the substantial bounty on both their heads. Lissa heard every word with her supernatural hearing. Her heart suddenly hammered against her ribs with frantic rhythm. The phantom wound of her fear throbbed with fresh pain. That evening, she couldn't settle. She found Dorian on the small porch, staring out at the ink-black sea. "He will find us," she said without preamble. 7 years and his obsession has only grown. He will never stop hunting us. Dorian didn't react with surprise. He simply continued watching the waves. "Perhaps he will," Dorian acknowledged. "His resources are diminished, but not eliminated. It's possible that eventually, someone will recognize us despite our precautions. We've always known this was possible. She moved to stand beside him, wrapping her arms around herself. I am afraid, she admitted. Not for myself. I am afraid of what he will do to you when he finds us. You betrayed him, helped me escape. His rage toward you might be even greater than toward me. She turned to look at him. I couldn't bear it if you were destroyed because of me. Dorian finally turned to face her, and in the pale moonlight, she could see fierce, protective intensity in his ancient eyes. Lissa, he said, and the way he spoke her name was a vow. I have been a coward once in my immortal existence. I stood by in silence for 3 decades while Adrian systematically broke you, told myself it wasn't my place to intervene. I will not be a coward again. He reached out, his hand cupping her face with infinite gentleness. Let him come. Let him find us. I would rather face destruction fighting beside you than live another 8 centuries in the safety of cowardice. His touch was warm, steady, and utterly certain. It wasn't the possessive touch of an owner, but the reverent touch of a partner. In that moment, the fear didn't vanish, but it was joined by something stronger, a fierce, defiant courage. She leaned into his touch and felt the world settle. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me, for waiting, for being exactly who you are. The love between them came to full realization, not in a dramatic moment, but in gradual accumulation spread across years. It was a quiet, sturdy thing, like the wind-twisted trees that clung to the coastal cliffs. It happened one evening in their 10th year in Silverwood, during a winter storm that made even their solid house shudder. They sat together by the fire, sharing the couch, a blanket across their laps. Lissa had been reading aloud from a book of poetry, her head resting against his shoulder. The words blurred as she became aware not of the poetry, but of the moment itself, the profound comfort of his presence, the scent that was distinctly his. She stopped reading mid-verse and felt his attention shift entirely to her. He shifted slightly, and his hand found hers under the blanket, his fingers lacing with hers. Neither spoke, the moment suspended in firelight and the sound of the storm. And in the silent language they had built, this simple touch was everything. It was a question, "Are you ready?" It was an answer, "Yes." It was a promise, "I will cherish this." It was acceptance, "I trust you." The ice that had encased Lissa's heart didn't just thaw, it shattered, melting away in the warmth of genuine love offered without conditions. She turned her head and kissed him, a soft, tentative press of lips that carried years of unspoken gratitude and rebuilt hope. He kissed her back with gentleness that made her chest ache, a reverence that told her she was treasured not as a possession, but as a partner. It was not the kiss of a king claiming property, but the honest affection of someone who had waited patiently, who had let her heal at her own pace. It was the kiss of a male who understood that her trust was a gift to be honored. Their life together took on a new dimension after that night, the cottage transforming from a space they shared into a home they had built together. They were a unit, a partnership of equals who had each chosen the other with full awareness. Dorian's love was constant, quiet reassurance, steady as the tides. He learned the geography of her trauma, the particular triggers that would cause painful memories. He never tried to fix her or rush her healing. He simply held her when the trembling started, his presence a shield against the ghosts of her past. In turn, she learned to see the complete person behind the quiet advisor. She saw his subtle humor, his deep well of genuine kindness, his unwavering moral compass, his refusal to compromise his integrity. She saw the strength in his patience, a force more formidable than Adrian's aggressive dominance had ever been. She fell in love not with a savior, but with a complete person, a good and decent male who saw her truly and loved what he saw. Their life settled into patterns that brought profound satisfaction. They gardened together, their hands in the same dark earth. They walked along the cliffs during the deepest hours of night, talking for hours about everything and nothing. They read aloud to each other by the fire, occasionally acting out dialogue in deliberately theatrical ways that made them both laugh. Lissa found herself laughing often, a real, unburdened sound of genuine joy that she hadn't heard from her own lips in decades. It startled her every time, the realization that she was happy, that the endless nights were filled not with dread, but with contentment. It was quiet, unassuming happiness, but it was real and solid and hers. She had not destroyed a kingdom to find this life. She had simply walked away from an existence that was destroying her and found, by some miracle, a life that was building her back up. Adrian's hunt had transformed from the methodical search into all-consuming obsession that defined his entire existence. His kingdom had stabilized somewhat over the years, reaching a new equilibrium that was a pale shadow of its former glory. He ruled over perhaps 40% of his original territory, held together by fear and brutal enforcement. The magnificent court had been replaced by younger vampires with more ambition than wisdom. He had rebuilt some alliances, but these were transactional relationships. The palace felt hollow, echoing with emptiness. Adrian moved through it like a ghost himself, the ghost king indeed, haunted by what he had lost and unable to move forward. He still poured resources into the search that his diminished kingdom could barely afford. He had grown thin over the years, his face taking on a haggard quality unusual for vampires. Obsession had worn at him, eroded something essential, and it showed in the feverish intensity of his eyes. He told himself it was about justice, about punishing treason. But in the long hours before dawn, he knew the truth. She had been the mirror in which he had seen his own magnificence. Without her, he was forced to see himself clearly, and what he saw was an empty, angry creature who had mistaken control for love. He needed her back, not because he loved her, but because her absence had revealed the void at his center. The lead that finally proved credible came from one of Lord Valerius's former associates, a vampire looking to buy his way back into Adrian's good graces. He spoke of a small coastal town called Silverwood, where a vampire matching Dorian's description had been living for years, working at the docks. There were also reports of a female vampire, a skilled herbalist who bore a striking resemblance to descriptions of the lost queen. It was a small detail, but the informant had verified it through multiple sources, and the timeline matched. Adrian didn't send his army. This was intensely, violently personal. He took only 5 of his most loyal guards, vampires whose loyalty was ensured through blood oaths. They traveled swiftly, moving at supernatural speed, their passage a dark streak across the landscape. Adrian's mind was a storm of anticipation and rage, and something that might have been fear. He played out the confrontation 1,000 ways, imagining her cowering, her begging. He imagined Dorian broken and pleading. He imagined finally feeling whole again. It was late afternoon when they arrived on the outskirts of Silverwood, the sun still above the horizon, forcing them to wait in an abandoned building until darkness fell. Adrian sent one guard to scout. The guard returned with confirmation. There was indeed a herbalist matching Lissa's description, living in a small cottage on the cliffs outside town with a male companion. They were known in the community, liked even, integrated into the mundane rhythms of human life. The guard reported their likely location. Adrian felt savage satisfaction rising in his chest. After 7 years, he had finally found them. They waited until full darkness, until their full strength was available, and then they moved. It was late evening on a day that promised spring, the air holding that quality of seasonal transition. They approached the cottage on foot, moving with unnatural silence. As they crested the small hill, Adrian called for them to stop, to let him approach alone first. He wanted to see her face when she realized he had found her. Lissa was in the garden beside the cottage, humming to herself as she worked in the evening darkness. She was tying up pea shoots, her hands moving with practiced confidence, her posture relaxed and open. She laughed, a bright, unconscious sound of pure contentment, as a night bird landed on the fence near her. Adrian felt that laugh like a physical blow, the casual joy in it so foreign to the careful creature he remembered. Dorian emerged from the cottage, wiping his hands, and he smiled at her, a slow, warm expression full of genuine affection. He walked to her with easy familiarity, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What's amusing you?" he murmured. "Everything," she said, leaning back against him with complete trust. "The world, life, how unexpectedly beautiful it all turned out to be." He pressed a kiss to her temple. It was a perfect moment of ordinary peace. Adrian stepped forward, deliberately making noise, and the sound shattered their moment like dropped glass. He heard both their heartbeats accelerate, saw Dorian's body go rigid, watched as they both turned toward the sound with expressions that shifted from surprise to recognition to calculation. Dorian's arms tightened protectively before he gently moved her behind him, his body becoming a shield. He didn't draw a weapon, but simply stood there, his feet planted in their garden, his expression calm and resolute. Adrian called for his guards to show themselves, and they emerged from the darkness, spreading out to cut off escape routes. Adrian dismounted with deliberate slowness, wanting them to feel the weight of this moment. He walked toward the broken fence, his steps measured despite the rage churning in his chest. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving from Dorian's defiant stance to Lissa. He took in the entire scene, the ridiculously small cottage, the messy garden, her simple clothing stained with dirt, her hands showing signs of labor, and Dorian standing before her like a guard with absolute protective determination. A sneer twisted Adrian's lips. "So this is what you left for?" he said, his voice rough with anger and bewilderment. "A hovel barely fit for humans, a peasant's existence, manual labor and dirt under your fingernails. And him," he spat the word, "my chief advisor, a vampire of 8 centuries, reduced to dock work and playing house with my runaway wife." Dorian remained silent, his gaze steady and unwavering. But Lissa's reaction was different. Standing in her garden, with the male who had shown her genuine partnership, facing the vampire who had broken her for 30 years, she felt strange, unexpected calm. Yes, the fear was there, but looking at Adrian now, seeing him truly for the first time, with the clarity that distance and healing had given her, she realized something profound. He was just a vampire, not the all-powerful figure of her nightmares. He was a bitter, empty male who had crossed a continent not to reclaim a queen, but to soothe a wounded ego. "You destroyed my kingdom," Adrian snarled, his voice rising with barely controlled rage. He took a step forward, and Dorian immediately mirrored the movement. "Everything I built over centuries, my alliances, my power, my reputation, my legacy, all of it burned to ash because of your vindictive scheming. For what? So you could play at being human in this pathetic little life?" He was looking for a reaction, searching for fear or regret. He wanted to see the cowering queen he remembered. But Lissa stepped out from behind Dorian, moving to stand beside him rather than behind him. Her hand found Dorian's, and their fingers locked together with easy familiarity. She met her former husband's furious gaze without flinching. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried with absolute clarity. "Your kingdom was built on lies and fear and exploitation, Adrian. It was a house of cards held together by ignorance and blackmail. All I did was stop holding my breath, stop propping it up. I showed people the truth, and they made their own choices about whether to continue supporting you." Adrian stared at her, momentarily speechless. He had expected tears, pleas, justifications. He had not expected this calm, unshakable composure. This vampire who looked at him not with hatred or fear, but with distant, clinical pity. His gaze fell to their joined hands, and his sneer deepened. "He turned you against me," Adrian said, his eyes locking on Dorian with murderous intensity. "This treacherous bookworm poisoned you with his whispers, manipulated you." It was then that Dorian finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, but carrying an edge of steel. "She needed no poisoning or manipulation. She had the truth about who you were and what you were doing. You just never bothered to listen to her, never valued her intelligence, never saw her as anything more than a pretty ornament. I didn't turn her against you, Adrian. You did that yourself, night after night, year after year, with every casual cruelty and every public humiliation." The quiet defiance in Dorian's tone, the absolute lack of deference, seemed to enrage Adrian more than anything else. His hand moved to the hilt of his sword, fingers wrapping around it with visible tension. "I should destroy you where you stand," he hissed, his fangs extending with his rage. "I should tear you apart slowly for your treason and make her watch. Then I'll take her back, bind her with blood oaths if necessary. She is still my wife, still my creation, still mine by every law of vampire society." A sound escaped Lissa's lips, surprising everyone, including herself. It started as a small bubble of disbelief and then grew into something unexpected: laughter. Not the bright, joyful laugh Dorian had come to love, but a sound laced with irony and profound sorrow for what Adrian had become. She laughed standing in her garden, beside the male who had shown her what love without ownership looked like, facing the vampire who had tried to break her spirit, and the sheer ridiculousness of his posturing struck her as deeply, darkly funny. The sound cut through Adrian's rage like a blade, stopped him cold, with his hand frozen on his sword. It was the absolute last thing he had expected. He stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to process this reaction that made no sense in any scenario he had imagined. He had come here prepared for confrontation, for battle, for the satisfaction of seeing her broken. He had expected to find a vampire consumed by vengeful hatred, someone whose every action had been motivated by thoughts of him. And in the sound of her laughter, in that one crystallizing moment, he finally understood the devastating truth. He saw it all with horrible clarity. Her serene face showing contentment rather than fear, the protective but equal way Dorian stood beside her, their intertwined hands speaking of genuine partnership, the simple, undeniable peace that radiated from them. She hadn't done it for him. None of it had been about him. It hadn't been an act of war, a declaration of hatred. Hatred would have been a compliment, would have meant he still mattered. This was something far worse. This was indifference. She hadn't destroyed his kingdom out of rage or revenge. She had simply stopped protecting him, stopped propping up the structure, stopped sacrificing her own well-being to maintain his facade. Her actions hadn't been the grand gestures of a vengeful goddess. They had been the quiet, practical steps of a vampire leaving a dangerous situation. She had just been closing the door behind her. And she had succeeded in building something new, something that clearly brought her happiness, and he was completely irrelevant to it. She had moved on, had healed, had found love, had created purpose and meaning, all without him being part of it in any way. He didn't haunt her nightmares. He didn't fill her with burning need for vengeance. He simply didn't matter anymore. The fury drained out of Adrian like blood from a wound, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness that was more painful than any rage. He looked at her, truly looked at her for perhaps the first time since her transformation, and he did not see his queen, did not see his creation, did not see his possession. He saw a complete stranger, a vampire he didn't know, with confidence in her bearing and dirt on her hands, looking at him with weary sadness rather than the intense emotions he had expected. He had lost, and not in the way he had feared. He hadn't lost a battle or a kingdom. He had lost relevance, had lost significance in the life of the one person whose validation he had come to need. He had hunted a ghost of his own making, only to find she had become an entirely different person. Someone real and solid and happy, building a life in a world that had no place for him. His hand fell slowly away from his sword, the fight draining out of him, because what was there to fight for? He could kill Dorian, could drag Lissa back by force, could bind her with blood oaths, but to what end? She would look at him every night with that same pitying distance, and he would be forced to see clearly what he had become. The thought of spending centuries forcing her to remain at his side while she felt nothing but contempt and pity was more humiliating than any defeat on a battlefield. Without another word, moving like a vampire suddenly aged beyond his years, Adrian turned away. He walked back to his horse with stiff, mechanical movements, his guards watching in confusion. He mounted his horse in silence, and for a long moment he sat there, his back to them. He still didn't look back, couldn't bear to see them standing together, content and complete without him. He spurred his horse forward and rode away, his guards scrambling to follow. And the dust from the road rose up behind them like a funeral shroud. Lissa and Dorian stood together in the garden, watching until the last of the riders disappeared into the darkness, until even their supernatural hearing could no longer detect hoofbeats. The evening air, which had been so tense moments before, was now still and quiet, broken only by the distant sound of waves and the occasional call of a night bird. The world had held its breath, and now it was breathing again. Lissa let out a long, shuddering sigh, and the last of the tension drained from her body, decades of accumulated fear finally releasing its grip. She leaned her weight against Dorian, her head resting on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her with steady strength. They stood there for a long time, rooted to the earth of the life they had built together. The past was finally, truly behind them. It was not a ghost to be feared anymore, but a story that had reached its end. "It's over," she whispered into his chest. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over." He kissed the top of her head. He took her hand and led her back toward the warm, welcoming light spilling from their cottage windows. Inside, their fire was still burning, the room warm and inviting. The world outside was growing darker as the night deepened, but in here, in their small space carved out of the vast world, there was light and warmth and safety. There was home. But the story was not quite finished, because Adrian's obsession, once denied its object, turned inward and became something more destructive. He returned to his kingdom and tried to resume his rule, but he was a changed vampire, hollowed out by the confrontation and the realization of his own irrelevance. He became erratic, his decisions increasingly irrational, his paranoia growing to consume him. He saw traitors everywhere, suspected every remaining advisor of plotting against him, trusted no one. His kingdom, already weakened, began to fragment further under his incompetent and increasingly tyrannical rule. The vampires who had stayed out of opportunism began to look for exits. His neighboring rivals, sensing his instability, began to press their territorial claims more aggressively. Within 2 years of his return from Silverwood, his kingdom had shrunk to just the palace and its immediate surroundings. And it was Lord Valerius who finally ended Adrian's existence. Valerius had lost everything when Lissa's letters destroyed his smuggling empire. He had been forced into hiding, had spent years rebuilding in the shadows, and his hatred for Adrian had grown into an all-consuming need for revenge. He infiltrated what remained of Adrian's court through a proxy, a younger vampire who posed as a potential ally, and he waited patiently for the right moment. It came on a night when Adrian was alone in his chambers, the ghost king sitting in the dark, dwelling on his failures, his guards dismissed because he couldn't bear their presence or their pity. Valerius entered through a servant's passage, moving with predatory silence. And he struck quickly and without mercy. Adrian, lost in his brooding and weakened by years of obsession, barely fought back. Perhaps some part of him welcomed the end, the release from the empty existence he had created. Valerius drove a wooden stake through Adrian's heart with savage satisfaction, held it there while Adrian's eyes went wide with shock, and then removed his head with a silver blade to ensure the destruction was permanent. The Ghost King, the vampire who had ruled a significant territory for centuries, died alone in his empty palace, killed by a former ally he had betrayed, mourned by no one. When news of Adrian's death reached Silverwood months later, through the same traveling merchant, Lissa felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief, certainly, the knowledge that the threat was permanently ended, but there was also a strange, melancholy sadness for the vampire he could have been, for the potential he had wasted, for the love he had been offered and had thrown away in favor of control and possession. She didn't celebrate his death, didn't feel vindication or satisfaction. She simply acknowledged it, added it to the closed chapter of her past, and continued with her life. She and Dorian remained in Silverwood for many more decades, eventually becoming something of an institution, the mysterious couple on the cliffs who never seemed to age, and who helped the community through their healing work and teaching. They watched generations of humans be born, grow, and die, formed careful friendships, contributed to the town's prosperity. Eventually, as humans began to notice their unchanging natures and ask uncomfortable questions, they moved on, traveling to a new location to build another chapter of their endless existence. But wherever they went together, partners in the truest sense, two vampires who had found in each other what they had not found in centuries of existence: genuine love, mutual respect, equality, and the simple peace of being truly seen and valued by another. And on quiet nights, when they sat together watching the moon rise over whatever landscape they currently called home, Lissa would sometimes think about the girl she had been, dying in a cramped room, and the queen she had become, beautiful and broken in a golden palace, and the vampire she was now, healed and whole and happy. She would think about how the worst period of her immortal existence had led, through pain and courage, and the willingness to walk away from what was destroying her, to the best period, to a love that was real and lasting, and built on the solid foundation of mutual choice and respect. And she would reach for Dorian's hand, and he would take it without words, and they would sit in comfortable silence, two immortals who had found, against all odds, exactly what forever was supposed to feel like.